Hello, everybody. My name is Melina Abdullah. I'm an organizer with Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. And this is not a drill. This is a series that we've been engaged in for the last 14 weeks. I believe it's 14 weeks. I might be off on my counting. And so we are here to discuss tonight what defunding the police means. There's been calls all across the country and across the globe around defunding the police, and there have been questions. What does that mean? In places like Minneapolis, we know that it has translated into a complete commitment to disbanding policing as we know it. We also know that in cities like ours, in Los Angeles, the people have pressured the mayor of the city to roll back $150 million in funding from LAPD. But we know that defunding the police really stands along a continuum. And this is kind of a newer conversation, even though Black Lives Matter has been engaged in this work for at least the last 5 years. And for generations now, people have been calling for the abolition of policing as we know it. And so we're sitting here talking about the defunding of the police, talking about police abolition, and really getting into some serious conversation. I want to uplift as we look for our third guest, and Megan is providing us with tech support. Can you please reach out to Pete White? He needs the link. He's texting me asking for the link, please. We're going to talk about all of these things with three brilliant guests, but before we get to that, I've been encouraged by one of our elders, by one of our movement elders, someone that we call Baba in Black Lives Matter Los Angeles in particular, who's guided us almost since the very beginning, and who's been a personal mentor to me and to Mark Anthony and to Patrice for many, many years. Baba Akili always encourages us to celebrate our victories. And so before we get into the conversation, we want to get into what's been won just in the last week alone. In the last week alone, we have won some major, major victories. We have won the passage of Breonna's Law in Louisville, Kentucky. Many of you know Breonna Taylor was murdered in her own bed when police were serving a so-called no-knock warrant on the wrong house, right? Came in and murdered Breonna and then tried to criminalize and arrest her boyfriend. We just won the passage of Breonna's Law, which bans no-knock warrants. And so congratulations, shouts out to BLM Louisville, to Chanel Helm, who's been on this, I don't know what we call this platform many, many times. We're so thankful and grateful to their work in Louisville. We also want to uplift that while we are not claiming the $150 million in return of the people's money from the LAPD budget as a victory, we do acknowledge that it's a step forward that was won by the people. And so we know last Wednesday, the mayor of this city was forced to announce that he was returning $150 million of the LAPD budget and reinvesting it in communities of color. We're going to make sure that we are loud, that if we're back at his doorstep as necessary to make sure that money goes to the right place, but also that we continue to advocate for more. We also want to uplift what's happening in Minneapolis. Minneapolis City Council on Sunday announced that they were not just going to defund police, they were disbanding their police department. That is a huge victory. This is not because politicos decided, you know what, maybe policing is bad. This is because the Black Voices Collective, which is the Minneapolis chapter of Black Lives Matter, pushed them into it because thousands upon thousands of people have been in the streets because we have gotten up and said, you know what, We want you to remove police from Minneapolis schools, remove them from colleges, remove them from parks. But we also say that's even not enough. We need to disband Minneapolis police. So all of this is moving, all of this is happening. We also want to uplift, there is victory in the struggle itself. On Sunday, we had more than 100,000 people on the streets of Hollywood. Just yesterday, we had about 5,000 people all chanting, "Jackie Lacey must go." We are mobilizing people, and people are chanting around the nation and around the globe to defund the police. And so here joining me on This Is Not a Drill tonight are three of my favorite people in the world. Haewon Asfaw, who is one of the original members of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. She disappeared for just a minute because she was busy getting her graduate degree, and now she's plugged back in, and we have missed her. And Haewon is back, and we're going to have a conversation with Haewon, who's representing Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. Richie Reseda, who is a brilliant organizer and co-founder of Initiate Justice, who I'm claiming, even though he's not officially joined, he is a comrade of Black Lives Matter. He is the brother from another mother of my sister. I guess that makes you my brother too. Patrice Cullors is our mutual sibling, so that makes us siblings, right? And then Pete White, who I would get down with in any struggle. He is also a member of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. He is founder of Los Angeles Community Action Network, and the fiercest organizer for and with houseless communities on this planet. So we're all here to talk about defunding the police. We're here to talk about what police abolition means. And I'd love for you to just kick us off, Pete, because I know that you have Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's definition of what abolition is. And so if you could just start with that, if we could start with what abolition means, we can have a conversation about police abolition, and then we'll move into this current moment, defunding the police.
No doubt. First of all, thank you for having me on tonight. Richie, Haewon, what's up, y'all? What's up, peoples? I think it's important to center the scholarship, right, and the brilliance of Dr. Ruthie Gilmore on this question of abolition. And these are her words, right? Abolition seeks to undo the way of thinking and doing things that sees prison and punishment as solutions for all kinds of social, economic, political, behavioral, and interpersonal problems, right? Abolition, though, is not simply decarceration, put everyone on the streets. It's reorganizing how we live our lives together in the world, right? And there's a whole lot there to pack, right? But that is the scholarship. That's the brilliant scholarship of Dr. Ruth Gilmore, right, of Critical Resistance fame, and Craig and other folks, right? That reminds us, much like when we think about revolution, people are thinking like, yo, revolution is the blood running in the gutters. No, it's the radical shifting of the minds, right? It's the radical shifting of the idea that we're powerless, right? Abolition seeks to undo that thinking, right? That narrative thinking of white supremacists that say prison and punishment is the only solution, right, to all of the social, economic, political, behavioral, and interpersonal woes, right? And when we get into defund, I think once we make the move, whenever we do, to sort of the defund conversation, we can then talk about how we're moving towards that radical shifting of resources first. So the radical shifting of our minds, but then the radical shifting of resources away from an institution rooted in slave catching, right? For the promise of plantation capitalism back towards our folks and our methods and our healing. So that's what I got for Ruthie. I'm channeling her for right now. And that's what I got.
Well, good. Thank you for channeling her. We always need her wisdom and her brilliance in this space. And for people who are unfamiliar with critical resistance. They've been doing this work for decades. Can you tell us quickly, Pete, who critical resistance is and what it is they do?
I mean, critical resistance has been putting forth an abolitionist perspective on decarceration for decades, right? Created by, in concert with, right? Because the one thing that I always remember, another super soldier sister, Maya Angelou, reminds us that there is nothing of note, right, that has been created by one person, right? And so while I lift the name of Ruthie, I'm also lifting in earnest all of those organizers who have carried that message, who have seeded this abolitionist framework up out of Oaktown, right, up out of Oakland, but now there's chapters here in Los Angeles that's moving steadfastly towards abolition of prisons.
Right, right. And I think it's really important that you're offering that frame, and that you mentioned that the system of policing, and I always remind people that I don't just organize, I'm also a scholar, and I think this intellectual work is hugely important. And I think that people think sometimes that it's just, the radicalism of organizers and activism that is saying extreme things, right? So when we say policing evolves out of slave catching, right? It's not an exaggeration. Anybody can go read almost any book, right? I'm thinking about the newer works by people like Khalil Gibran Muhammad out of Harvard. So if you need some white people relevance, right? He teaches at Harvard University, right? Who will validate what we're saying on the streets. Policing is a remnant of chattel slavery, right? It was founded out of chattel slavery. And so when people think we're being extreme by saying abolish the police, it's really important that we remember that it would sound ridiculous for us to be saying, no, we shouldn't abolish slavery, we should reform it, right? How can you say that a remnant or a piece of chattel slavery should be reformed rather than abolished, right? I'd love to hear Haewon and Richie, maybe we start with you, Richie, kind of jump in on why it is, and I don't want to put identities on you, but we've had lots of conversations about this. You are an abolitionist, right? So why are you an abolitionist? And what does that mean in terms of how we see policing and prisons, and also that relationship between policing and prisons?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everybody. Honored to be here with y'all. I absolutely am an abolitionist, 100%. I'd love to, I think a perfect place to jump in to this conversation is to pick up right where you left off, which is where the police came from. It might seem like a radical idea in these days for us to say abolish the police, but I think it's important to point out that the first 199,000 years of human history, there were no police and there were no prisons. And yet here we are. We made it. Our families made it. Our ancestors made it. We didn't need the police. We didn't need prisons. We made it here. Even in this country, in the United States, for the first 300 years of this country, if you start back from 1619, when folks first started pulling up, there were no police, right? Well, about 250 years, there were no police. There was not a need for police, or I should say there was not the use of prisons as the primary way of getting justice. So there were prisons here and there. There are mostly religious institutions that Catholics went to when they had done something wrong so they could be by themselves and be with God and come out changed. That was the idea behind them. But prisons weren't a function of government that everybody went to if they broke the law. And police weren't a function of government that went and took you to prison. What actually happened was,
not saying, just so, because our viewers are going to say, so we want to go back to 1619. This is not saying, especially as Black people who know who we were in 1619, this is not saying we want to go back to 1619. This is not a MAGA speech, right?
Not in the least. Right. No, not in the least. The point that I'm making is the moment that America decided it needed police and prisons as its primary way of quote unquote getting justice was the moment that we ended slavery or ended slavery. So up until 1868, 65, it's real scholars on here who can tell you, up until the end of slavery and the 13th Amendment, we didn't have the system of you quote unquote break the law, you get arrested, you go to prison throughout the United States. That's not how we did business. Actually, what people who had citizenship at that time, which were white people, we did not have that citizenship. They didn't want police either. They didn't want prisons either. They dealt with their problems within the community. They might go to civil courts and sue each other and have the judge intervene between two private parties. But there was none of this, the people versus you, and now we're going to lock you up business. Nobody found it necessary to do that until there was Black people free. Once Black people were free, then all of a sudden we needed the government to step in and get dangerous people, and we needed to have district attorneys and prisons and police. And so that really tells us something about what the purpose of policing has always been. So as an abolitionist, I do say that our community, we go back not to 1619, but to the indigenous communities that existed before this place was even colonized, when we dealt with our harm amongst each other. Now it's going to be, I don't want to oversimplify it. It's a complex process to decolonize our minds from our addiction to punishment, decolonize our minds from being able to rely on the police to quote unquote solve all our problems or make us feel like they're solved because they come up and they show up and do violence. But we are, the call for abolition really is a call to say healthy communities that are invested in, that where people have what they need, are communities where people enact less harm. And when people do enact harm, we can invest those resources in one, changing behavior, and two, transforming the systems that led to that harm in the first place, instead of investing our resources in acting out violence against those people.
Mm-hmm.
See, that's how you could tell I'm old, because I'm talking before I hit unmute. That was really brilliant, and I think that that's important as people begin to process, well, what is abolition, right? That we have to remember that this isn't the only way. This has not always been the way. And so, you know, sometimes it's difficult for people to imagine what things can look like. But when you say, well, there's examples, like this hasn't always been the way, I think it helps us to sit back and go, oh, well, what can we do to move things forward? Haewon, I'd love to get you in on this conversation, who also identifies as an abolitionist. And after Haewon kind of talks about her view of abolitionism, we do want to talk about how that relates to defunding the police. And I know that we're live on Facebook. For Facebook viewers, please, if you have questions or if you have comments that you want us to ask, please enter them in the comments so that we can engage. This is meant to be a community conversation. So I'm just trying to facilitate for now, but we absolutely want to involve you in the conversation. So for Haewon, how does this whole question of abolitionism, how is it defined for you? And also, I think it's important for us to kind of go down the road of personal narratives. How did you become an abolitionist? Because not everyone is there yet, right? There were times when we didn't ascribe to abolitionism, when we didn't even know that an abolitionist meant anything other than, you know, freedom from traditional views of slavery, right? That we thought abolitionism was something that was from the 18th and 19th century, and didn't understand that it's something that's applicable now. So I'm sorry for the long wording on the question, but please help us.
No, that's great. I appreciate that setup. And I just want to start by saying abolition is a lifestyle. It is a healing journey, and it's like an ongoing process. It's not something that I feel like I've been learning it as I have continued getting older and moving through different spaces. And I really love that Pete opened up with Ruthie Gilmore's definition of abolition, because it really it expands our understanding of abolition is not just around like policies and systems and relationships, but it's around culture. It's around how do we change the ways that we interact with each other, and the ways that we put people before profits and welfare before, and like how do we move from that before, you know. And I think, you know, I started learning about prison abolition, and mostly around like criminalization and just like understanding policing at a really young age. I was part of an after school program at my high school, Cleveland High School, where I just got my hands on literature and conversations that I didn't access in the classroom. And it was really interesting because that same year I went to like a social justice magnet where we, we're studying like race and gender in the United States. And it was very much rooted in the past. So like, learning about slavery, learning about Jim Crow. And meanwhile, it was that same year, Hurricane Katrina happened. We had all these racist immigration bills being pushed in California. And I was like, we need to be talking about the things that are happening now and stop talking about racism as something of the past. And so I feel like it's just kind of a wild moment to be alive. I honestly never thought I never thought I'd see this in my lifetime, people talking about defunding the police and abolition. And I think I would just add to that we're in a new moment too, where we are being asked. I think when I saw us taking down the police state, it was, I think I thought of it in the sense of violence, and we would have to take up arms, and just thinking about past movements of surveillance and locking up leaders. And our movement is just so strong right now that we're learning from our history and the things that have happened, and they're just not going to play us again. And so I think that, I was telling Richard with me were having this conversation of like, wow, like all we have to do to abolish and defund the police is to completely legitimize them. Like, making a commitment not to call them, figuring out alternatives when we're in unsafe situations, when someone we know is in a crisis or needs help. And that's stuff that a lot of us have been doing already. For me, it's easy to imagine because I've never called the police on anyone. It's not something that I was raised or taught to do. And so these are things that have really been practiced. And I think the other piece I would add around abolition is that, we're in a moment where we have to have more nuanced conversations, more around race, and really through an intersectional lens, because the only way we're going to delegitimize the system and win is if we build a mass multiracial, multi-generational movement that's rooted in queer liberation, Black liberation, that's challenging capitalism and white supremacy as a whole.
Right. Let's go down that road a little bit, because viewers are asking, what's the relationship between capitalism and policing? And so I'd love for you to pick up on that, Haewon, and then Pete, maybe Pete and Richie, if you want to chime in on that question.
So I'll just start with connecting it to what's happening now. Right now, we are seeing people flood the streets, and it's not just around police violence. It's really around how the system has set us up, and the pandemic especially exacerbated all of the failures and cracks in our system. It wasn't the government that's been, helping our community in the last few months. It's been us folks on the ground who have been putting together mutual aid funds, that have been figuring out how to get folks who are unhoused the resources they need in this time. And I think it just really magnified all of the problems with our system. And, when I was walking through, I live in Oakland, and when I was walking down the street, maybe the second day of the unrest, I was looking at what people were writing on the walls and the businesses they went after. And it wasn't local businesses, it was the banks, and it was the Targets and the Walgreens, and folks had clear messages: abolish work, abolish the police, stop, end capitalism. And so I think people are, and so if the community does not want the police, so they're clearly here for one reason, and that is to protect and uphold, corporations and white wealth, and this legacy you're talking about that comes from slavery and oppression of Black people and stolen land. And so I think we're in a moment where people are realizing and now we're seeing just extreme violence on all people, white people, elderly. And so we're in a moment where you can't really deny who the police are here to protect and serve. And that's really to uphold this system of white supremacy that's just rooted in the oppression of, so many people.
I hadn't thought about what you said, Haewon, and I'm sorry, but you really are making me think about something, that this moment, because people are asking why this moment is different, right? I think that delegitimacy, right? The way in which people, and especially Black people, have relied on each other through the pandemic, and how that delegitimizes the state and capitalism. And then you have the murder of George Floyd, where you could almost see Derek Chauvin's, I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name, but you could see the history, he looked like a damn overseer, right? He looked like, you could see, you could see his ancestors in his face, right? And I think that combination of things, I hadn't thought about that before. I hadn't thought about that people have been awakened to the building of community through the pandemic, because you started hearing about mutual aid, right? People started practicing mutual aid before this spark that really kind of meant, lots of folks saying now defund the police and even abolish the police. So I didn't want to belabor it before Pete jumps in, but I just think that really, I didn't think about it in those terms. So thank you for that.
Oh man, I know we've only been at it a few minutes, but I'm just like, I love it. I love it. I love it. I'm thinking KRS-One. Every time you say overseer, I'm like overseer, 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 officer, officer.
They too young. They don't know what we talking about.
You
telling your age.
Come on, Richie. Don't let her do you like that. So look.
Richie fancy. He might know. Yeah.
No, but you know what? I'm thinking a couple of things, just in terms of that, the question around the relationship between capitalism and policing, right? The function of police was to protect property, right? But who was that property that they were protecting? Us. We were the property, right? And so from the get-go, the relationship between policing and capitalism was locked down and locked in together. And then even after the 13th Amendment, when we think about the 13th Amendment, that was really about, okay, so how do we continue to have free and cheap labor, right? Well, then we'll just lock them up. And so there will always be a thread of policing and capital, a through line, I should say, that runs. The other thing though, and this is something you said earlier, I think we have to remember that policing, and when we talk about it, it wasn't an aberration, it's a continuation of history, right? And so we think about slave catching, but then we think about the enforcement of the Black codes, the enforcement of Jim Crow, right? The enforcement of sundown laws, right? And then we push forward and we think about the ways now that the police serve that same function. So when we think about capitalism and you think about gentrification, you cannot talk about gentrification without finding surveillance, without finding community policing, right? Community policing is nothing more than counterinsurgency tactics, right? And so if it was community policing in Kabul, it would be counterinsurgency, right? It would be that program. I would also say, even now, when we're thinking about locally the $150 million, right? Now, funny story, it wasn't the mayor who came out with the $150 million give back. It was Herb Weston, right? It was Herb Weston.
Because he tried to erase, he is trying to erase
right.
That Herb announced it in the morning and then he just echoed it that evening.
That's right, right? So Herb Weston announces it. He's like 100, 150.
Tell people who Herb Weston is, because not everybody will know.
Yeah, so Herb Weston, local council member, he is our council president emeritus. Been doing some real good things as of late, like around housing, really coming out. When I say as of late, not like just right now, but over the last few years, just taking bold strides in housing, housing stability, bringing new types of design in, like good stuff, right?
And represents South Los Angeles, parts of South Central Los Angeles.
I was gonna say, did you say South Los Angeles, Melina?
You know what I mean. And he's Black because his name is Herb Weston. They may not know he's a Black city council member, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, now we going back and forth on Herb Weston. You made me lose my damn thought. But I mean, bottom line is this: the mayor, Herb, comes out and says, "I got 150 million on it." The mayor 3 hours later was like, "Oh no, if he can go 150, I can go 250 million." Right? All of this happening without an ask from organizers and community. All of this happening without a demand. And so that should let us know what is left on the table. The other thing that we have to be careful about, though, we are now hearing rumblings that there will be an attempt to run that 150 million back through the community safety partnership, right? Remember that thing called community policing, and running it through some of the academics. And so it's one thing for them to say or to state we got 150 or 250 for you. It's more important that we are very clear about where we want that money to go, right? And I know once we get into sort of that defunding conversation, we can hit that. Because when you look at, Los Angeles, 150 to 250 million that they're talking about taking back. Seattle, last night, they're also talking about cutting the police budget in half or maybe disbanding. We know we have Minneapolis that's also talking about disbanding, but we can't sit back. We can't rest. We got to go even harder in the paint, and we've got to take them the plan. And as Richie was saying earlier, and all of us, like I know I've been watching all y'all. I've been watching all y'all grow up, and I love y'all. And we got to talk about the cultural practices that are already in play, right? Like in West Africa, something called bamboo talk, right? Ain't no police, right? We come together in a circle and talk about harm, right? We know what to do with those who continue to bring harm into our communities, right? And so there are practices that are already in place that we can use, right? It's not like this thing that we have to figure out and that's never happened before, because it's happening now in real time.
So I think that's a really important point, and I'm going to have Richie weigh in on the relationship between policing and capitalism, but I just want to highlight a piece that you're speaking of, that when we say police abolition, that does not mean the abolition of community safety, right? That we do believe in community safety, right? We believe in practices that keep our community safe. But for Black folks, policing has never equated to community safety. It's equated to community trauma and community harm. So how do we radically reimagine community safety in a world without policing in its current form, right? And so that's, I think, a really important point, because people who haven't been engaged in this police abolition conversation sometimes go, but then what do we do? Because I can't honestly claim to be Haewon, right? I have called the police before, right? And I think a lot of women who've experienced domestic violence have felt like we've had to call the police. And so, I wouldn't do it now, but then what choice did I have, right? And so I think as we talk about abolition, it's really important to also remember that abolition doesn't just mean tearing something down. It also means building alternatives. And so Richie, as you get the last comment on the relationship between policing and capitalism, I'd love, because I know that you've been a strong advocate about the building piece, right? Not just the tear down piece, but the building piece. If you could incorporate that into your response.
Yeah, I'll be quick on the policing capitalism, because I feel like everybody was so thorough. But I mean, the relationship between police and capitalism is as simple as this. A couple weeks ago, we had people breaking into stores and taking things, and the police responded by then attacking people. And that's pretty much what it comes down to, of what is more important. If you're willing to hit me in the face, potentially kill somebody on a high-speed chase because a thing was taken without being paid for, we know if you're for public safety or if you are for profit safety. And that's all I'll say about that.
That's a quotable. Somebody write that down. If you are for people safety or property safety, that's it, right? That's the question. Yeah. Which one are you for, right? Which side are you on, right?
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah, exactly.
And we see that throughout the system, right? But because our system is so obsessed with crime and punishment, we've been blinded to what harm is and what is actually more harmful. So, I don't want to only talk about small acts of harm. I want to talk about serious harm, serious community harm as well, because we need to talk about all of it. But just to complete this point, we live in a system right now where the very first time I was detained, I was 11 or 12 years old in the 7th grade, and I was horseplaying. The next time it happened, it's because I left school early to get a haircut. The next time it happened because I was quote unquote vandalizing. So you're kidnapping a child, tying them up, holding them against their will because they left and got a haircut, or because they were selling drugs, or because you heard that they were going to have a fight. So it's like, wait, what is more harmful? If anybody else came into your house who didn't have a badge on and came and kidnapped you and tied you up, and you said, what are you doing? And they said, well, you were selling drugs, so I'm kidnapping you now, and I'm going to hold you at gunpoint for as many years as some random politician or judge thinks is necessary. We wouldn't go for that. So I think it's an important piece as we decolonize our minds and delegitimize this system that's actually creating more harm than they actually quote unquote solve. But going into this piece about building up, thank you so much for that question, Melina, because it's so key. When people say things like, what are we going to do when, you know, there's serious violence happening in our communities? I just want those folks who are not yet in our movement, but hopefully will be, to understand that we see that and we recognize that and we know that's valid. I didn't go to prison because I was selling drugs. I didn't go to prison because I was ditching school. I went to prison because I was robbing stores with a gun. It was a very dangerous situation. My behavior had to be interrupted. Abolition doesn't mean that we just let that behavior go and it's just the wild, wild west and nobody cares. Abolition means we seek to transform the behavior and the system of oppression that led to that behavior, instead of just acting out violence on it. Because when I robbed those stores, here's what didn't happen. The stores didn't get their money back. The people who are in the stores, they didn't get any kind of counseling or therapy to heal from the trauma. They very well may be traumatized to this day. There was never any conversations with me on behalf of the system to figure out why this 19-year-old kid would be doing that and putting my life at risk over $1,500 here, $700 here, right? And when I reached out to my victims, once I was in prison for 2 years, I reached out to apologize to them. I got a letter from the district attorney of Los Angeles. Name is Jackie Lacey. She was the DA there. And she told me if I tried to reach out to my victims again, she will file new charges on me. So we don't have a system that was seeking to solve anything. What they wanted is they wanted my Black body in prison for as long as possible. They tried to give me 150 years to life. What could have happened instead was I could have been brought before my community. I could have been brought before the families of the people who are in the stores who are traumatized, and put in a position where I had to listen to each person, how they were impacted by my actions, their moms, their sons, their kids. When I read my court paperwork, I found out that one of the people in one of the stores I robbed was a recent immigrant from West Africa who had since quit his job because he was so afraid to work in a store like that again, because it brought up trauma and stuff from stuff he had lived in the past. And this was somebody who was providing for an immigrant family. When I read that, even I think I was 21 when I finally sat down and read my stuff, I just broke down and started crying. I was so aware of the harm that I caused. And that's actual accountability. I could have then talked to this person. I could have then worked with that family to whatever extent they felt comfortable, worked with the community to do something to be of some service to them, while also having conversations about my own behavior, my own understandings of patriarchy, and my violence made me a man, and having fat pockets made me a man. All of that work could have happened in my living room. I didn't have to be beat into a concussion by LAPD and dragged off in my throw up and held at gunpoint for 7 years to understand those lessons. Actually, what happened instead was I was so busy fighting for my own survival in prison, it took me 2 years to even think about the robberies that I did. So that's not accountability at all. And the last point that I'll make when we're talking about what we need to build up, because there's so much. One, I want to name, especially for folks who are making a lot of donations now, like they're with the movement and they want to donate. Yes, donate to the Movement for Black Lives, donate to Black Lives Matter LA, who are defunding the police, but also donate to these organizations that do bring us real safety. Donate to the survivor networks who are literally working in the shadows to survive, to rescue people who are in human trafficking, right? Donate to the LA Cans of the world who are literally building the power of unhoused people so that they can get justice and they can have safety and they can have resources. Donate to organizations that are sitting down and there are organizations that do transformational healing work with folks. There are organizations that do transformative justice work with folks that are under-resourced. Why? Because the police have $3 billion and then we're all fighting each other for scraps. So when we see, many of us grew up in communities where there was gun violence. We grew up in communities where there was sexual violence, in homes where there was domestic violence. And we've been told the police are there to keep us safe and bring accountability, but that's not actually true. If we were given the resources we need, there's organizations that already exist. There are people who already exist who have social work degrees, who have the training to go in and intervene nonviolently and stop that violence from happening. And I'll give you just one example. When I was in prison, I started a program called Success Stories, where we were talking about toxic masculinity as a way of like seeing ourselves. And we always knew, we were working with 18 to 35-year-olds in prison yards. Most of them are active, most of them are active gang members, involved in drug deals, all the things. We always knew when violence was gonna take place, and oftentimes we were able to interrupt it and stop it from happening. Why? Because we were not there to do violence. We weren't gonna kidnap somebody and send them to the hole at the end of the day, the way the police were. So actually, by being unarmed, by not having a power dynamic, by not having the threat of, the same threat that a police officer would have, we were more trusted to come and stop real violence from happening. And that same model is being used in communities all around the country. It's being used in Richmond, in Oakland, in Brooklyn. They have models where they have people from the community who are going and interrupting violence, Chicago. And these folks aren't riding around with guns and bulletproof vests. They're riding around with love and respect from their community, and they're able to actually sit people down and solve problems. And imagine if those people had $3 billion budgets instead of the police.
Right. And that's some of the work that a brother of ours, Pete White, and I get down with Akila Sherrills. That's some of the work that's happening in Newark, New Jersey under Mayor Raz Baraka, where he's moving some of the money from Newark Police Department to community care teams that do exactly what it is you're talking about. There's questions coming in, and one of the things that we talked about in these pre-conversations is, as we talk about defunding the police, and I'd love for us to get a narrative around, because defunding the police can go all the way to police abolition, but it doesn't have to start there, right? Some calls to defund the police are less than that, right? There's a continuum of what it means to defund the police. A pre-conversation that I had, I think it was just me and Haewon having these conversations, was, are there spaces though for complete abolition? So defunding the police could be cutting Seattle, Pete raised this, cutting Seattle's police department in half, right? But are there places right here, right now, where we can imagine complete police abolition, and we think that most people will be with us? One of the questions that's being raised by viewers is, what about our schools? Our schools, how ripe is it for us to bring schools on and say schools are a place where we can abolish the police? Police do not belong in our schools. And Brother Joseph Williams, who was on last week's platform, talked about the importance of removing police from LAUSD schools, and he's kind of leading some of the work here in Los Angeles, along with a lot of the students, to say police have no business in our schools. And if you're from the same generation that Pete and I are from, you remember that there was a time when there were no police in schools, when they had sometimes big brothers from the neighborhood in yellow jackets that met you at the door to make sure you, for me, it was Mr. Williams, that you had a good day, right? Shook your hand real hard and said, have a good day. So the question from the viewer on Facebook is, are schools a place that's ripe for complete abolition? So let's get one person to respond to that. Don't all jump at once.
I'd love to hear from Haewon, because I just know Haewon's work started with decriminalizing the cops back when we were kids. Excuse me, decriminalizing schools back when we were kids.
Yeah, we have been working to get the cops out of our schools for a very long time, starting with really trying to decriminalize student discipline issues. Like, it should not be a police officer handling issues like tardiness and having a marker in your backpack or having drugs on you. There are police are not trained to actually address those situations in a way that actually promote safety and accountability. When I was as a young person, a lot of my friends and folks that when I was organizing, also a lot of young people, their first interaction with the system was the police, was at school, which is like wild, right? Like nobody should have interaction with police, especially children. And I remember when it was not super trendy to talk about getting rid of the police in schools. It was actually pretty risky because of all the repercussions that come with challenging police in this police state that we live in. And especially when we look at how funds are spent, how underfunded our schools are in terms of programs, resources, services, mental health supports, all the things that young people need to thrive and learn. We don't have them in our schools. And so again, with this pandemic, all of the under-resourcing and all of the, just where our energy has been invested is being amplified. And so shout out to Black Organizing Project, shout out to YJC, shout out to all the folks that have been doing this work for over a decade when it was hella risky. And where we're at in this moment is the fruits, and Community Rights Campaign, this is the fruits of our labor and our work, and we had the vision, we saw it, and we're here, and people are getting it now.
Right. And Students Deserve, who's our partner in this, right? Which really centers the work of student organizers, right? Recognizing the people who are the most directly impacted should be empowered to offer the solutions and be in the lead in the struggle for the solutions. So shout out to those young people, those young organizers. And I know Haewon and Richie are like, we're young, you young, but you're not 16, right? And so we know that the kids, the real kids, they have the audacity, and they've garnered the power and the respect, and they have the radical imagination to say police don't belong in our schools. They've won some major victories already, ending so-called random searches in the schools. They're winning this anti-pepper spray campaign. They've won, they said in the midst of a pandemic, why should we have to be worried about a calculus test? And so they won the universal passage of all classes for students this semester. And they're calling for the removal of police from schools, point blank, period. And so we wanna just uplift that and know that they're also inspired by the work that's happening in Minneapolis, where they have Minneapolis public schools have severed their ties. There are no longer any contracts with police in Minneapolis. All up and down the state of California, those contracts are open. I want to lift up my brother is a school administrator up in the Bay Area. They recently, as of yesterday, canceled their contract with Alameda County Sheriff's Department. And he said, it's okay for me to share this. Apparently the Sheriff's Department came back and said, well, we'll do it for free. And they said, oh no, that's all right, right? But that tells you like what this machine is really about. You know, that the sheriff said, you don't even have to pay us for the contract. We'll come in and do it. So, you know, this work is moving and we're winning. We haven't really gotten into, and maybe Pete can jump in here, what defunding the police means, right? So we've talked a lot about abolition, but is it illegitimate to say, you know, well, let's defund the police. Maybe we can't get to immediate abolition right now. Is that the watered down version, or does it somehow feed the idea that we can get to abolition, maybe not this budget cycle though?
No, it most definitely fuels and feeds the idea that we can get to abolition. And so let me just first say, just on that last point around the organizing that's happening in schools, I can remember meeting Mark Anthony, right, with the Community Rights Campaign, and Patrice, when they were students, seeding the ideas and the moments for now, right? Fighting back against the 1033 program, right? Fighting back against the military grade weaponry in schools and winning, right? And so it's just important to both point forward, but also point back from which we came, right? When we think about defunding the police, folks, particularly in LA, but folks all across the country been having this conversation a long time and actually running campaigns to do it. I mean, when I came into the work, it was Michael Zinzin and Kappa, right? That was like, we need to take all the money back and give it back to the folks, right? But in real time, like some of the examples for me, particularly at LA Can, one of the most gross examples of police being used to solve societal problems was in 2017. There was a $100 million spent on homeless prevention. I'm gonna say that again. $100 million spent on homeless prevention. 87 million of which went to the police. Now, I want y'all to tell me how in the hell the police gonna solve homelessness? Police build houses? Because, you know, the root of homelessness is not having a house, right? Does the police provide services? So what is it that they are doing that justifies $87 million of $100 million earmarked for houselessness? I have the answer for you, not a goddamn thing, right? The other thing that we see cycle after cycle after cycle, right? The things that actually make us sell: housing, healthcare, jobs, right? Just all of those things, counseling, therapy, right? Libraries, all of those things for the last 25, 30 years have been the line items that have been devastated and devoured. But there's one line item on all budgets that are recession proof. It's the police budget line item. So bringing us to this budget session, there are 16,000 LAPD, there are 16,000 city jobs and departments at risk of being cut. What types of departments? The Department of Aging, right? These are the Meals on Wheels programs, the Department of Transportation, the Economic Development Department, right? This is the department that post-COVID is supposed to create job programs and then go out and find resources to give to communities that have been suffering from organized abandonment forever. The Housing Department, right? All being cut. But on the other side of those cuts, you have the Police Department with a 4.8% raise. Now, I want y'all to hear this next part really, really good. But in addition to the 4.8% raise, they are getting bonuses, right? They are getting bonuses because the Police Protective League says, because we argue if crime is going down, we should be removing the budgets of police. The Police Protective League goes back to the mayor and says, our officers deserve a bonus because their role isn't the traditional crime-fighting roles. I want y'all to hear me. They say now because they play the role of drug counselor, therapist, social worker, and EMT for the next 3 years, if you have a bachelor's degree, you will get $290 extra per pay period and $190 extra if you have an associate's. And so what we're hearing at the same time that they're cutting all of those things that actually could make us safe, they are rewarding the police, right, with additional resources. And so when we say defund the police, we are very clear: cut all the resources out of all community policing. Like anything that they're doing, all that counseling, all that, remove all that dollar. All the overtime, remove all the overtime dollars right now, right? If crime is going down as it has been going down for 15 years, it is time to cut the damn staff in half, right? And a list goes on and on. So when we talk about defunding the police, we have some very clear places that we know can be cut right now as we work towards this ultimate abolition of the police.
So that's great, right? Police are complaining that they're doing too much. We say, so stop doing it, right? You don't have any business or expertise. You are not a trained therapist. You are not a social worker. You are not even an EMT worker, right? You're not trained to be to do that work. So give it to the people who are. That's what we need. There's something else, and I didn't realize how short on time we're getting. People are asking for book recommendations. I love giving a reading list. So let's start though with your reading list, and then I'll fill in. So what would you have people read, Richie? You're muted, so I'm not that old.
Yeah, when you said you did it because you're old, I was like, then I must be old because I did all. I think a great place to start is Patrice's article in the Harvard Law Review about abolition. It's concise, it's not a whole book, but it's thorough.
Haewon?
You know, something that really, there was an organization called Generation 5. I think they are now under Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, but they had, and it literally changed my life as a sexual abuse survivor, around how do you talk about transformative justice and child sexual abuse, which is something it's kind of, you know, it's a touchy subject. And for me, it really was an entry point to my healing. So it's free online. I'll send it in the chat.
Pete?
Yeah, I think something right now that I'm reading, Policing the Planet. We're in the book, but it's really a book put out by Christina Heatherton, Dr. Christina Heatherton, and Jordan Camp. That's really rooted in the struggles toward abolition of police over the last 10, 15 years. And so it really lifts the stories of what folks like us on this Facebook Live have been doing, right? And it's important because it both exports the victories, but even more importantly, it exports when we fell short, right? And it tells those stories so we don't continue to repeat some of the same madness over and over again.
Right, and I absolutely recommend A Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis, which talks about abolitionism. It'll give you, you know, a really good, good kind of grounding in abolitionism. And then Khalil Gibran Muhammad, The Condemnation of Blackness, is a phenomenal book to read. I'd love for folks to pick those up, and I have a lot more, but I won't give a whole list right now.
You asked us a question, but you wrote down a list. That ain't fair.
You know I like to read.
You ain't fair.
I got it too.
Yeah, I think about the books.
Yeah, keep asking me for book recommendations. I can go on.
Melina, can I add one thing around defunding the police?
Yes, please.
I think another key, just something really important to name in this particular moment, is that defunding the police means divesting in white supremacy. Because that is what police are here to uphold and sustain and protect. And I think, you know, my colleague friend Vanessa said this to me earlier today, which just really landed, which is all of us, we are in a moment of like some real reckoning that all of us have to do, some really deep self-examination, some reflection, some hard, painful, uncomfortable reflection, and accountability for how we have upheld this white supremacist culture. And culture is, you know, behaviors, beliefs, values that are passed down, maybe consciously, unconsciously, and it's entrenched in all of our systems. So as we go through, you know, the healthcare system, education system, it's so insidious that it starts to live in our bodies. And there are things about white supremacist culture, like Tema Okun talks about white supremacist culture being either or thinking, perfectionism, defensiveness, afraid of open conflict, paternalism, all of these things that we normalize. And we see it in our movements where we have been taught to be afraid to struggle with each other. We've been taught to fear that. And so I think it's a moment that for all of us, especially as we see this growing mass movement of people of all genders, sexualities, races, nations coming together under this banner of Black Lives Matter, that we really start to interrogate the ways that we uphold the system and realize, like, you know, that we embody policing in some ways, whether it's cancel culture, whether it's revenge culture, whether it's like, you know, also around intersectionality, like how are we pulling the people who are the margins of the margins and centering them in our movement? And that includes folks with disability or folks with different abilities. That includes trans women and gender nonconforming people and trans people, like all of those who are falling off the ledge. Like, how do we center them in this movement? Because if we don't, we're going to be doing this again for another group of people.
Yeah, so time gets away, right? We've had our hour, but I'd love to close it out with each of you giving just a 1-minute last thought. I'd love for you to include in that thought a call to action. What's one thing that our viewers can do right now or in the morning, right? But what's one immediate thing that folks can do? But you have 1 minute each. So Richie, let's start with you.
Yeah, just for me, I feel like it's always important to just make this really real for people. I had the opportunity to go to Finland that went through this process back in the 90s, where they defunded their police and prison system. They're not completely abolished yet, but what they found was the number one way to cut down on drug crime was to decriminalize drug use. The number one way to cut down on property crime was to give universal basic income, where everybody's guaranteed the basic amount of money you need to survive. And most interestingly, the number one way they cut down on violent crime was by enfranchising disenfranchised communities. So they have a anti-violence task force that has no law enforcement arm and no guns, that just goes into communities, poor communities, immigrant communities, teaches folks the language, connects people with resources, gets them healthcare, gets them jobs, gets them education, and they saw their violence in those communities go down by 75%. My call to action for how we can do that here is when a lot of things have been happening on social media, a lot of things have been happening in the streets, and that's important. But my call to action for people is every time you see those graphics pop up that say, call your city council member, that say, call Jackie Lacey's office, that say, call or show up to the police commission on Mondays, that we actually do those things. Because we can all pass information back and forth on social media about how down we are, and that's important, and showing up in the streets is important. But these politicians want money and votes. And until we show them that they will get neither of those things from us until they listen to us, they don't have to listen to us.
Ashe, that's great.
Ashe.
Hey, Mom, what you got? Haewon.
Oh, me? Sorry, I thought you said Pete. I think mine is more of a personal call to action. So I've been in movement for a very long time, and you forgot to mention that before I went to school to study community mental health, I was in Ethiopia for almost 1.5 years. And part of that journey of going to my father's homeland, really building with my family, learning my culture, language, to then really understanding the importance of really being hands-on with looking at trauma, resilience, and healing justice as central to our movements. It all just kind of came together. And I just want to tell folks that, or I just want to remind folks that there are really two sides to this fight right now. Like, factions are not helpful. Critiques around how people are doing things is actually part of the work. It's a good thing. We should be engaging in this struggle together, and we have to stay focused and not distracted. And I feel like, I keep reminding people that that is the work. When this shit comes down, we have to rebuild, and that's where the hard part comes, and it's going to require all of us. And I think I just want to say that, because our people have been through so much, and we have to remember that we're not perfect, and we're holding pain and complexity and contradictions. And some of the people I love the most are the most problematic people in my life. And I don't give up on folks. And it's transformative justice is not theoretical. You said, Melina, you've called the police on people. I haven't, because I've had community at a very young age. I had people like Patrice and Mark Anthony that I can call when I was in trouble and in bad situations. And so I think that, so 2 calls to action. 1, all of us, especially non-Black people of color, we have to connect our struggles and the suffering of our people to the stories of Black people and the genocide of Native people in this country, because we need to come together and have our common enemy, just like our common target in that way. And I think the second thing is that, that we're practicing these things on a personal level, because, how do we expect to take on the system if we don't have these practices to navigate conflict and figure out how to struggle together outside of the system? We have to do it simultaneously, defund the police, and also uplift alternatives that center the collective and not this white concept of individualism, and I'm very important, and that's your problem, not mine.
Great, Pete.
So for me, it's all of what they said. So I'm gonna be really quick. Another world is possible, y'all. Right? All around us. I was reading the news today, and I'm looking at UCLA. They're talking about divesting from LAPD, and USC, the same thing. From Seattle to Minneapolis, right at the federal level, everyone's clamoring around this idea to defund the police. And so another world is truly possible, but we can't give up. We can't get relaxed. We can't allow them to throw us scraps on the table that are meant to appease us and that are meant to drive our allies. You know, when I talk about allies, they're either allies or all lies, right? But meant to drive our allies back into their slumber, right? My call to action is getting out in these streets, right? My call to action is getting rid of problematic prosecutors, all skin folk and kinfolk, right? My
So
call
you
to
mean
action.
Jackie Lacey must go? Is that what you're saying?
Hey, this is exactly what I'm saying with my 501c3 status. The other thing that I'm saying is
I
all
don't
day
have
long,
a
goddamn it, Melina.
501c3.
Yes.
I can say
Yes.
it. I can say it. Right.
The other thing that I'm also saying is this clown shit like 8 can't wait and all of that. Reject these notions right out of hand and understand that those are caretakers of white supremacy. So begin to identify the difference between abolitionists and caretakers of white supremacy.
Ashe. I just want to lift up, yep, that's a mic drop, kind of, to close us out. I just want to uplift that this is not a drill. We're here every Thursday night at 7 o'clock. Please tune in. If you enjoyed this session, it'll be posted on our Facebook page. Please share it with your friends. I'm going to give a quick call to action, and that is, it's really important. I was one of those people who said I'm not a joiner, right? I've never joined an organization. I didn't realize what I was joining when Black Lives Matter was birthed around us. I think Haewon was part of that circle when we pledged to build a movement, not a moment, but I didn't know that that would mean that, now I'm part of an organization, right? But what I've learned through this is that this is what you said in the beginning, Pete, right? Like, no transformation happens through an individual. So find an organization that you get down with, find people that you like, and link up. If you're scared of the word join, just test the waters, because we're not going to be able to engage in one people movements, right? One people movements don't work. And in fact, when they glorify one person, that's usually used to undo the work of the many. And so we want to make sure that we move together. So join organizations like Black Lives Matter, like White People for Black Lives. Hit up LA Can, hit up Initiate Justice. Join all these organizations that are now listed on this Facebook chat, right? Figure out what it is you can contribute. And then just very tangibly on Sunday night, this Sunday night, we will be having our Black Lives Matter general meeting. We've been able to move tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people into the streets over the last week, 100,000 folks on Sunday, tens of thousands of folks before that, 5,000 or so folks yesterday. The in the streets work is what my brother Kendrick Sampson calls the red carpet moments, right? But the work is about more than the red carpet moments. It's not just the turn up, it's the organizing work, it's the political education work, it's the willingness to do the work, to make sure we got bullhorns, right? To make sure we got water when we out in these hot ass streets. So we need you to be present for all of these things. If you want to know how to plug in or what's coming up, please go to blmla.org, blmla.org. We want to thank Brother Philip, Megan for doing the back end support, for helping us with the tech. And I know we went a little over, but join us again next week on This Is Not a Drill. Thank you so much, Haewon, Richie, and give people your handles so if they want to follow you.
Okay.
Thank y'all. I appreciate y'all so much.
What's
I
your,
love y'all
what's your
back.
Pete. What's your handle?
Hey, what? You're back? When Melina was like back in LA, I was like, I've been seeing Haewon up in the Bay.
I ran from Oakland to be here.
Look, we still on. Pete, what's your handle?
LA Can Network. LA Can at work at twitter.com. So what? They can feel the love that we got. We don't care about that.
What's yours?
It's _HEYYTON. Haewonton. I just put in the chat.
And Richie, what's yours?
My personal one is at Richie Reseda. The work that we do to abolish prison statewide is at Initiate Justice, and our work to end patriarchy is at Prison Feminism.
Great. And I'm Melina Abdullah at Doc Melly Mel. BLMLA is on Twitter at BLMLA and Instagram at BLM Los Angeles. Again, thank you so much to everybody who made this happen, and we'll see you again next week, inshallah.
Yeah.
Thank y'all. Peace.